Welcome to the ConcussED podcast, where we dive into the world of brain health and resilience. I'm Dr. Stephanie Adams, your host to the science, stories, and breakthroughs behind concussions. Whether you're an athlete, a parent, a healthcare professional, or just naturally curious about concussions, you're in the right place. So, let's get started. In today's conversation, I'm joined by the brilliant Katie Mitchell. Katie is a clinician scientist focused on sensory motor control, concussion, and brain health, particularly with women and parasport athletes. Katie is the founder of Thrive Neurosport, which focuses on elevating concussion and injury risk management through clinical care and education. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Toronto and a physio and athletic therapist with Women's Para Hockey of Canada. Welcome, Katie.
Thanks, Stephanie. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
So good to have you. I know we've spoken previously outside of this context, but I was really excited to get you on and just pick your brain on a few questions so that we could share your knowledge with the community on a more global scale. So I suppose just to kick things off, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you found yourself focusing on concussion and brain health in your work.
Yeah, and that kind of historically takes me back to being an undergraduate student, starting to work in sports, as we called them, like student trainers in the late 2000s. And I started out working with like men's rugby, women's ice hockey. And so at that point, 2007, 2008, we did not have a lot of management strategies in the concussion space. And as you know very well, with rugby in particular, I witnessed a lot of incidents of head injury, concussion, as well as a myriad of other injuries. But we didn't really have tools available to us. And even as a student, I was still very early in my career. But I just remember this little thin scat card that I carried around in the medical kit with our team athletic therapist. It almost looks like what we'd call the scat recognition tool now. That was what we were limited to. And we often would have, arguments with coaches and things of why we believe players should just be removed from a game, when they're staggering their gait and just, looking completely out of sorts. So that for me was really a catalyst of understanding why these things were happening. And I think as I went along too, I recognized that myself as an athlete growing up sort of in that era in contact sports like soccer, football, and ice hockey as well, that, I had experienced some of these things myself and these events were familiar. So as I evolved through, I went on to do an athletic therapy program at Mount Royal University in Calgary and continue to work youth football, so American football there. And again, exposed to a whole different level of just at the more youth and adolescent level, and then also with parents, and managing these injuries, in 2011, 2012, again, just starting to see things start to evolve. And I think as I moved through, those progressions really started to motivate me to pursue this kind of work, and questions emerged from how to best ensure that we're keeping athletes safe as the bottom line, and understanding the impacts over the long term of, returning to sport, returning to activity and exercise after injury. And I went on to do a physical therapy degree as well at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And that really introduced the neuro side. We do neurological rehab and PT from a acute care standpoint, from stroke and acquired brain injuries and moderate, severe traumatic brain injury. So it really just sort of gave me that full spectrum of what I had seen in sport all the way through to how, the intricacies of neuroanatomy and neuroscience. And very shortly after I finished that degree and practiced, I still just saw these massive clinical gaps and knowledge gaps in care. So it led me to pursuing my PhD kind of around 2015, 2016 is when I started looking into that with Dr. Michael Cinelli at Wilfrid Laurier University. And he was doing some interesting work with sensory motor integration, balance control at the time that, again, was literally just emerging, that we were testing athletes standing on force plates. Sort of the research that motivated me to get back into it, of understanding that we had these quantitative measures that we could start to look into, objectively evaluating athletes and ensuring that they're safely returning to sport and life. So yeah, I think just over the years, all these things started emerging as I was progressing through my own career that really aligned.
You have so many fantastic tools within your toolbox. I don't know if I've heard of many
PTs who are also an AT as well. Like maybe there's more than aware, but I think you're one of the first I've come across. Like I think that's so fantastic. There's so many bits that you've been able to delve into. I think I have no doubt that just adds so much to your ability as researcher and clinician. I've always thought that was so interesting when I came across your work. In terms of your current mission in the field, where's your focus at the moment?
Yeah, I think, and like this is pretty well known, but we know that the majority of the guidelines that have been created to date have been informed by research in a very small population of like mostly male collegiate athletes. And so I think for me, it's really like when I work with patients in the clinic, like they're never just that, like the odd time they are, but very few are that male collegiate athlete. And particularly with my work in para sports now as well, it's really opened my eyes to that we don't have this sort of diverse understanding of, you know, each individual concussion is an individual concussion. We know that they're very distinct, but also each person is distinct in what their experience is, their like even just their sport and exercise backgrounds. If we're thinking of an athlete population, there's a lot of sports that aren't necessarily in that spotlight because they're not on a big screen and they're not commercialized the same way, or maybe they're just not as obvious of how injuries occur and they don't happen maybe as frequently, but they may actually be more severe because of, like think of cycling and snow sports and those kinds of things that you just don't see them maybe as frequent. Like, every play in an American football game, you're seeing a collision occur. So for me, it's really looking at the broader scope of different populations and understanding, again, like the impacts of concussion on sort of sensory motor integration and different systems for each individual and kind of those characteristics that influence them throughout that recovery process. And then beyond that, as they return to, activities and sport in life.
That's so important. We get into that individualized like characterization, and that extends into the education stuff as well. So can you tell us a bit about your recent work on active recovery strategies and why this is such a key focus in the field?
Yeah, my PhD was mostly focused on kind of assessment strategies and different ways to manipulate like sensory and motor variables. So like balance control, we look like even physiologically increasing exercise exertion with like visual cognitive testing. So when I refer to visual cognitive, I think of the like dynamic visual acuity platform that we use as like a video game eye exam. So it requires some decision making, some executive function. And it was developed at the University of Waterloo by Dr. Christine Dalton. And she was a collaborator with us on that work. And so building off of that, we started to like really start to tease out things that maybe it's not even just what we test, but it's also the way we test and the way we actually characterize the outcomes from the test. So we could have a really strong test, but if we're not looking at the right outcome variables, it actually could look like not very distinct amongst a group with concussion and without. But if you sort of combine different variables, so like, for example, we looked at both speed and accuracy on the task. So we were able to differentiate like how athletes with and without previous concussion history actually like the strategy they used rather than just like one result. If we just looked at one score, like their accuracy score, we may have actually seen that they weren't different across groups, but the speed at which they gave those responses changed. And so that for me was a really interesting way to look at that. And also some of the like more fatigable things that we looked at, I guess the way that we structured our assessment was like following up at, immediate tests. So we looked at a post-exercise protocol, this visual cognitive test. And we looked at like 10 minutes and 20 minutes after they had been recovered from their exercise. And so that paper was published more as like a protocol to say, you know what, maybe these like one-time inciting point measures are not as accurate. And we might actually start to see things delayed that start to reveal those subtle deficits. And it really sort of translated for me to when an athlete, say, returns to sport and the duration of play time, that when we test things, we're doing it typically in a resting state or things. So when we're looking at like active recovery, we need to start looking at how that prolonged response looks, because athletes get injured when they're tired. So even if it's a musculoskeletal injury that occurs after they've returned to sport from concussion, it's typically like it happens when they're fatigued. So we know that from just general musculoskeletal injury research. So understanding that some of those like sensory and cognitive integration pieces may actually relate to that fatigability is something that I'd love to continue exploring in the future. And for now, right now, my postdoc is mostly looking at intervention. So moving away from that assessment piece, but still like being very much engaging and active and looking at like combined aerobic and resistance exercise programming, as well as what I call accessories as the sensory motor integration piece. So integrating things like ocular motor and visual functions, balance control and coordination, as well as like neck exercises like proprioception and strength that we know can be kind of like prolonged as well after concussion. And so we're looking at implementing that through a mobile app that was created at the University of Toronto by my current advisor, Dr. Michael Hutchison. So all across, let's say, from the spectrum of like from an active assessment all the way through to an active like return to sport is sort of where my research lies right now. But primarily like the kind of combining sort of theme, I guess, across those pieces are the sensory motor piece is like those visual cognitive components. It's a visual motor, cognitive motor, really connecting those dots so that we're not just looking at like physical tests and that we're engaging multiple systems and sort of collapsing some different clinical domain silos together.
It's so exciting because, I mean, obviously concussion doesn't just operate in isolation within one area. So the fact that you're bringing it all together, and really interesting to hear as well about the app that you're working on as well. So it sounds like a very much like watch this space, which I very much will be doing, because if you're working on something that could be looking at, I suppose, longer term brain health as well beyond that initial concussion recovery and RTP, and that could be really interesting. Excellent, excellent. And what about your work with parasport, in particular, so the work you've been doing on parasport guidance, but also if you've been doing any of the stuff that you've just mentioned within the parasport community as well?
Yeah, so in the Amsterdam consensus meeting was the first time that parasport was really brought into the concussion in sport group space, 2022. So that's really only just over, 2 years ago that we really kind of had a spotlight put on parasport as this kind of dire need to include these athletes in the current guidelines and develop some appropriate guidelines that are suitable for just such a vastly diverse population. So prior to that, I actually started working in parasport in, I want to say 2013 was the first event that I worked as medical staff. And so it had been a long time coming for me that I actually worked in sport along with my research all the way, like I still do, with Women's Para Hockey of Canada. And so I started working in para ice hockey about 10 years ago. So I never really saw this avenue to connect those things together as, my field work being involved in para sport and then having my research because there was no one doing it. And so I always just kind of made some notes and had some ideas, logged those things over time of like the work I was doing with athletes who don't have disabilities and translating that work eventually to parasport. And so after the Amsterdam consensus, I was invited to join the Concussion and Parasport group, which was formed during the COVID-19 pandemic by an international group of researchers and clinicians and athletes as well. And so the current co-chairs are Sherry Blowett and Dr. Osman Ahmed, and they have been really pivotal in just like bringing me forward into that space and creating this way for me to continue to pursue this work and combine my roles as a clinician and a researcher. So my postdoc right now, the app that we're working on, it's related to our sort of national sport governing bodies on the podium. And so with both Olympic and Paralympic sports, we're working on creating programming in the app that is can be help with sort of, we have a lot of decentralization in Canada because we're so geographically large. Primarily the project is to help address access to care and kind of harmonizing communication with clinicians and athletes in the national sports system. And the first part was adapting the current app to one, be digitally accessible for parasport athletes. So that includes like athletes with visual impairments, and other physical impairments. And then the second was to create programming. So the combined aerobic and resistance exercise, as well as those kind of sensory motor accessories, I call them, to be accessible for parasport athletes. And so, for example, we've created a new module that is designed for athletes who use wheelchairs or have lower extremity impairments that require like seated exercises. And so we're currently in like the build out of that and hopefully going to be implementing that kind of by the fall and through hopefully to like Milan so that we can capture some implementation and actually look at how para athletes tolerate that active recovery piece as one thing. Like, is it even feasible to do? Does it work well? Because we know there's a number of different factors that influence parasport athletes differently. And so one of them would be like just daily energy cost of mobility. And so for folks who use different mobility aids or prosthetics, they may already have a higher energy cost that like starting that early exercise as as early as like 48 to 72 hours may be too soon because they may be already kind of meeting those demands by just like going out for a walk or a roll. Starting structured programming at that point, we don't know what the response would be. We also know physiologically that athletes, say with spinal cord injuries, just have a different, just autonomic regulation response to exertion. So again, a number of different gaps that still remain there to actually look at how we feasibly implement some of these interventions. But it's sort of just scratching the surface by using this project to sort of start to look into those things. We've also gained a number of insights from both staff, like medical and performance staff, as well as para athletes on their previous experiences with concussion. And there's a couple other projects that I'm involved in that have sort of looked at, what are practitioners currently doing, because we don't really have any set guidelines. We've only really highlighted where knowledge gaps exist. And so the work right now is like looking at like where are the solutions and what are those solutions that we can get, start to work in at the moment.
That's amazing. I think the huge value, because I know I've interacted with a few different parasport groups, and there's a clear need to have better support. So I'm really excited to see what comes from that study. Excellent. So one of the questions that I wanted to pick your brain about, given your background, was in recent years, concussion guidance has very fortunately moved away from sit in a dark room until your symptoms disappear. Why is this? Why have we suddenly been able to sort of move away from that in the last few years?
Yeah. When we think of how any clinical guideline is created, it's an iterative process, right? So it's constantly evolving. And it evolves with what research and what knowledge we have. And so I think just in the early years of concussion management, the safe choice was just to do nothing, right? We didn't know. And so what would have been really innovative to do 8 years ago, and sort of people may have had questions and be like, are you sure you should be doing that? Now it's like, why aren't you doing that? Right. So I think we know physiologically exercise is medicine for the brain, and that there's so many benefits to exercise and the immediate and prolonged effects. So, as quickly as just producing more brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, it's like fertilizer for our brain and our cognitive functions, right? So if we can help facilitate some of that when we're, post-concussion is sort of this, like, call it like a metabolic storm. And if we can do anything to help restore those metabolic, like neurometabolic processes that are underlying the brain function, then, that is going to help optimize things. But it has to be a very carefully tailored, I think, dose response relationship, because again, we're talking about individual characteristics. And one of those big things that I came into my PhD was like just experience. Like, do people have experience with exercise? What is their sport training level? Like, when we start to look at what the general population needs are, if we're looking at a high performance athlete, then they may be up here because they've just trained to be there. So I find that some of the guidelines are so general across the board still, even though they're meant to be designed for sport, they still don't necessarily fully capture like where we need to go with highly trained individuals and high performers. And so I think that just, that exercise initiation piece, that's generally should be addressed across the board for the general population. That should be tolerated at a moderate intensity for most folks, unless they are severely sedentary beforehand. Like, that would be something interesting to look at. But just at if people just are encouraged to get outside and go for walks, like that should be generally tolerated. But it's into those higher ranges of getting into kind of like vigorous intensity of over 85% of your estimated heart rate max is where I think that we don't currently know a ton about yet. And also like the after effects. So that one study I discussed of just like, what does brain function look like after that level of exercise? Are they still able to make decisions quickly and accurately, those kinds of things, so that when they return to sport. So the active recovery piece, although that initial management, I think, is actually like we have a pretty good grasp on what we need to do in that like first week or two. But really the beyond that point, like once we're over that like 70%, which is kind of in that return to sport process, like phase 3, 4, the actual components of those later phases to prepare athletes, I think, is still very much lacking. So yeah, we've come a long way in 10 years to know that, yeah, exercise is okay. We can tolerate it. But I think it's like how you actually bridge exercise to like performance is still sort of missing.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We've come a long way, but I think, yeah, there's still a long way to go. And when we think about where we're headed next, if you had you to look forward to the next 5 years, how do you think or hope concussion prevention and management will differ than it does today? What would real change look like for you?
Yeah, it's hard because I've been involved with, I talk about this iterative process, and we're in the process of creating an adapted version of the sport concussion assessment tool, the Parascat, for athletes who are wheelchair users. And it's the kind of the first version of a Parascat. And so that starting point of where you create those guidelines, those processes, they have to sort of generally meet most of the population's needs. And you mentioned earlier, like, there's some athletes who just don't fit that like a 6-stage mold because they're not in like their competitive seasons are different. They don't. It's kind of designed around that weekly competition, right? So from field sports, when they're in season, they typically have like a game per week or a couple games a week, whatever. But if it's like a cycling athlete or something who are competing at, they're training all the time, right? But their competitions are sort of spread out. Or maybe it's, just an artistic sport or something like gymnastics. And there's just different components there. And while I don't think we need to have like 25 versions of a return to sport guideline, I think that's what, is trying to be like in a way avoided, because more complexity creates confusion. And then I think that would actually maybe develop some different issues in how the implementation occurs. Because that's really where I think in the next 5 years, I'm hoping that we look at what, we created certain tools, but how are they implemented? And that goes for active recovery as well. I think there's still a lot of fragmentation in how things are implemented, because, in a sport environment where there's established teams, you've got that like touch point almost every day. You've kind of got structure with your medical team versus groups who are decentralized, or it's private care, for example, private practice providers for more general population. There's a huge variance in like what exists there too. And I don't know if this problem really could be solved, but I think like from a access point, like in the implementation piece, we have like I said, we have a fairly good grasp on what works well, and we can refine that, but it's kind of getting to the point where it's like a little bit like saturated of like what that really looks like for that initial management piece. But how everybody accesses that is different. And so I think the understanding, implementation, and knowledge of practitioners is really, really huge. And I think just maybe perhaps like from that education standpoint, how do we create an adaptable framework that applies to more broader populations? Again, like implementing beyond that kind of typical field sport environment.
Yeah, yeah. The implementation piece is really interesting, and just having that ability to explore and test, like how are these tools or resources being used? Are they helping? Like, why are they not, if not? And having that athlete voice, clinician voice at the heart of that feedback cycle is so key. It's also interesting to hear your view as you don't need, a ton of different variations of the guidance, but we do obviously need some, and that's an approach with the work that I do with sports. We've been working on like a clustered approach, cluster sport based approach, just to have some of the similar themes. So putting the artistic sports together, even exploring how potentially some of the snow sports stuff might overlap with some artistic sports, trying to knowledge share and build those conversations across sports. Some will have more experience with concussion than others as well. So yeah, it'd be interesting as well. I think another area of watch this space is that implementation piece over the next few years as well.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the cluster piece because with parasports, like we kind of have different classifications, and that's sort of how we cluster is, athletes who use wheelchairs or have lower extremity impairments, or there's athletes with visual impairment, but they don't necessarily have a physical impairment. So, we're creating one tool, but we're gonna have to create a new tool for athletes with VI separately.
So it's like, we talked about, do we have a million iterations to be able to encompass all those little intricacies, or do we, create something that has some of that adaptability within a tool to, if this doesn't apply, then try this instead. It's sort of like a roadmap instead of having just a checklist for every little difference. And so, like I said, that creates a challenge. Like for me within my team, I work with athletes with a broad variable level of function. Some are ambulatory and some use wheelchairs for mobility or prosthetic limbs. So not everybody would fall into that one thing. So for me, I would have 7 versions of a tool to use for different athletes on our team. And so that again creates complexity. I think when you talk about how we apply across diverse populations, comes down to educating practitioners to be able to do so, but also creating some kind of adaptable pieces that come with options for things that give them that freedom to adapt it rather than being fixed. It has to be more flexible, I think, in the approach.
That makes a lot of sense. Switching gears slightly, what's one piece of advice you'd give to any coach or athlete when it comes to managing a concussion?
So I'm going to share some advice that I typically would an athlete or coach, if a concussion has occurred. So if I'm, on a bench or on the sideline and I've suspected that an athlete has concussion, I'm usually the person who ruins their day, right? So, they're pretty much their competition's over, their tournament could be over, it could be a really high stakes situation. So, you kind of have to translate that to them to understanding of why potentially they're being removed from sport, and understand the risks and things involved and the safety piece. I typically would say something along the lines of, we suspect that you have this injury. It's going to affect your lung function. It is risky to go back in for subsequent injuries. So if you've suspected something has occurred, even if you don't know for sure yet, it's always safer to err on that side of caution. I typically would suggest even if you maybe don't have a concussion, but you're experiencing some symptoms, you're not going to be performing at 100% anyways if you go back in immediately. You know what I mean? And perhaps it could even get worse over time. If you're trying to remove someone, suggesting that someone on the bench may be able to perform at your 75% and be able to fill in for you and be totally fine. So if you want to go, if you were to go back in, you could risk having, a worse situation and be out for much longer than if we were to take you out based on, just precautions today. Evaluate later, we'll play it by ear and see how things go. But if, you were to have a brain injury, that could potentially be a much greater problem. So I always try to say you're considering this moment and you might be frustrated about this moment, but if you look ahead, and I say this mostly every injury, I think too, is an ACL, an ankle sprain. If you're to go back out and play with this, you're going to be causing bigger problems on a longer term scale. And instead of managing this now and making sure that you are safe and, protected from further injury, then we're always going to remove that player. Because like I said, there's someone on the bench that can fill your spot and we can deal with this and manage it properly. But with concussion, even if we suspect it, it's always a removal, right? Even if you're not sure. So if it's the instance where you don't have that medical provider on the sideline, it should always be that if you have a mechanism and there's associated let's say those associated symptoms with something, you should always err on the side of caution and remove that player for evaluation. And if you don't have that availability on site, then it is an evaluation that occurs after. That's always my spiel about that. I think that people get so caught up in the moment and they don't think about that longer term issue. And that's where a lot of athletes end up, risking things that they shouldn't be. So
Totally. It's that if in doubt, sit them out. And you're right. Sort of reframing on the performance part. I've always believed, the person with the potential concussion or potential injury, they're almost in the worst position to make that decision for themselves. They sort of need that taken away from them in some ways.
yeah, we've run into issues too where, we're not
we actually didn't suspect that a concussion occurred, but if an athlete's not confident in themselves because of their injury history, they could clear their test and they had a mechanism and they're just like, we do that scat. And it's like, even we wouldn't return them, but let's say like it's a competition later that week or something, or they're a subsequent competition. If they're still not confident to go in yet, we would not clear them for going back. In that sense, even if a coach was wanting them to be back.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. And there's all like the psychological component that comes into it as well. Like if you think about the sports psychology side and the athlete, they have like fear of re-injury or like their pie of attention. If so much of it is fear focused, like they have such a small amount that they can actually focus on the performance job. Yeah, we could have a whole other side conversation on that stuff.
That's a whole other side of my research. Yeah.
Definitely. So, Katie, do you have any final thoughts about concussion that you'd like to share with those who are listening?
Yeah. And, if we haven't made it clear so far, concussion is a traumatic brain injury. And just as a, musculoskeletal injury, tears in tissue, ligaments, things like that, we don't have a way yet to quantify the initial insult of a concussion, right? So if we suspect something, we're pulling them out because there's no way for us to look in and see what's going on inside of your brain and your head. So it's, it is, I think, something that is still not taken as seriously, despite having a lot of, the amazing education and things around the world. I still think that athletes fall through the cracks in the systems. And that's typically, I think, in certain contexts of sport, whether it's professional, international sport, those places, as much as we have all these resources in place, there's still a lot of contextual factors that impact those athletes. And the same goes for in a recreational sense. It's, some people underestimate those injuries because they're not happening in this big, arena of contact sport. So if you have a slip or a trip, you could have a similar injury. And so those ones I think fly under the radar more because it is on that person. Like you said, sometimes the person with the injury shouldn't be the one making decisions. When it occurs out of the context of sport in general life, it's on that person. They typically then continue their day, seek healthcare maybe within 1 or 2 weeks. So I think at that level too, the education is still needed to understand that, it across the board in activity in life and sport that these things can happen and that they are serious. That is a much bigger theme, but just think that there's still some, like I said, that highlighting that implementation piece and like ongoing processes behind that are still fragmented.
Yeah, absolutely. So where can people find you and follow your work?
Yeah, I am active on socials, mostly like Instagram, LinkedIn. Yeah, you can find me at Thrive Neurosport is my handle, or just LinkedIn as Katie Mitchell. But I have a website for Thrive Neurosport as well as an education platform through ConcussED, Clinical Neurosport and Health Education. We do provide clinical courses there. I'm in the works of hopefully getting that redone this year to relaunch mine. But my colleague Sonia Vovand has a great vestibular course for post-concussion that is on that site too.
Amazing. And are those courses globally accessible?
Yeah, so for clinicians who treat concussion, they can access it from anywhere in the world.
Brilliant. Katie, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. It's really good to hear a little bit more about what you're working on at the moment. I've made some notes on things that I need to keep tabs on because there's definitely some really interesting stuff coming.
Yeah, you'll keep me accountable with that list when in the next 5 years. Check it.
Support.
I really appreciate, the conversation and the invite. It's always great to chat and catch up with you too.
Thank you for listening. The information provided in today's conversation is for informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you believe you may be suffering from something similar discussed in today's episode, please contact your healthcare professional.